Hello. I am short, so rather than standing behind here, I am going to stand over here, and that gives me more room to move around as well. So I'm going to talk in a minute, but I want to bend the rules of the format a little bit. You've all been sitting for about an hour now, so I would invite you to, in a minute, I want you to stand up, say hello to someone next to you, introduce yourself very quickly, and then the title of my talk is Fight the Bar Chart. So express to your partner whether you like bar charts, whether you make them a lot, whether you have any concerns about bar charts, okay? That is your assignment. So I will give you about 3 minutes to do that, and I will yell very loudly to stop you in my teacher voice, okay? You will recognize it because you know what teacher voice is. So please, stand up, shake it out, say hello to someone, and talk about bar charts. Okay. I am going to interrupt your conversation now. You have made a new friend. I appreciate the introverts among you chatting with other people. So now you have someone to talk to after the event or during the event. Hopefully you had a good chat and met someone new. As you can hear, my throat is a little hoarse today, so I'm going to take breaks and drink some tea. But hopefully you made a new friend, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about bar charts and sprinkle things in. Here's a bar chart. It is a bar chart of Chicago's 2020 budget. And 2020, if many of you know, remember it was a time, certainly there was this big thing happening around COVID. It also was a time when we saw one of the largest social mobilizations in the US in decades. So the movements around Black Lives Matter, and then turning into a movement to defund the police. And it dealt with a lot of charts like this. Charts that looked at police department budgets compared to other budgets, right? And like bar charts are a way to understand things. This is specifically in Chicago for 2020. You can see the police department gets a ton of money and other social services get far less. And this is fine. You know, budgets are statements of values. But bar charts, they don't really speak to you. They don't sing to you. They don't really communicate in ways that activate people. So we had a lot of activist groups like BYP 100 in Chicago taking this data to the street. And I want to talk about the difference between the two charts because this is also a bar chart, right? It's a bar chart made out of cardboard boxes. Cardboard boxes representing the exact same thing. So look at the lines. Same exact lines, right? Same exact lines. I just annotated them in the first chart. So what they did was they took this to a street and they used a novel material. First of all, they made it big. You cannot walk by this without paying attention to it because you're like, why is there a big stack of cardboard boxes there? It provokes our curiosity. They focused on the impact of that spectacle, right? Using the language of public arts. The media itself, cardboard boxes, speaks in a different way. These boxes are very hard to change, right? If you push them, they tip over. You can't really change them, right? These boxes, you can just pick it up and move it, right? The idea here is that this material lends itself to the idea of change, which was their goal, right? You can participate by taking this cardboard box saying, actually, I think we should move it over here. It makes change feel possible. And I think that's really valuable and a really important recognition of how this bar chart is different than the first one. You could ask questions to learn more about it, understand the historical context, but what I want to talk about is how data has moved to new domains. Domains that should push us to think about how we can change that first thing into the second. And I'm going to take this opportunity to throw a lot of examples at you, and there will be a quiz at the end. So as you see these examples, think about one that speaks to you. Okay? As you see these images, think if there's one that's, oh, okay, that one feels like it clicks with something I'm interested in. And I'm a computer programmer, I'm a technologist. I'm going to try to avoid talking about any of that and just give you a lot of examples and motivations to reset the boundaries of what data visualization is. Which is some of my goal. Why? Because we've gotten used to things like this. You all know the Gapminder illustrations. If you haven't seen it, you've seen things like this. Multiple types of encodings, animated over time, following the rules about visual attributes. And I think we've forgotten things like this. This is a quote from Eduardo Galeano, the great Uruguayan writer. It says, "In Central America, the more wretched and desperate the people, the more the statistics smiled and laughed." Right? That data is a tool of power in many instances. The quantification of something is used to create and drive change, usually by those with more power. And in power, in this way, I mean the ability to affect or enact change on some other group or oneself. So we've seen this movement of data into realms such as these, where it might have started in areas like the sciences or economics or industry, and data's moved to areas that I'm going to talk more about, like newsrooms, libraries, museums, nonprofits. Those are two different domains. The first one, sciences, statistics, business. The second one, I talk about these as pro-social settings. Not to argue that science is not necessarily good for society, but to say that the goal of the original fields is not to improve or betterment of society as a central goal. Okay? So, those goals are a little bit different. I have some words to talk about them, but those are two different lists. And I think what's happened is we've taken all the ways we work with data, surveys, bar charts, spreadsheets, and we've taken them from these domains and we've brought them to new domains with very different goals. And that creates conflict and power and disempowerment. So my argument is that the dominant data cultures that came to maturity in those fields, they didn't necessarily originate there, but I would argue they came to maturity there, don't really fit with the new pro-social settings of data use. And the response is, we just need a bigger toolbox. It's not that I don't, charts are fine, I make charts all the time, but sometimes we need to fight that bar chart and do something else. Maybe we need to make a cardboard one, or maybe we need to do some of a larger set that I'm going to talk about for this talk. If I go to extreme, the difference is this, right? If I really push my argument, the difference is how do we go from tools that have traditionally been wielded for exercising power on others to things that might be more liberatory, right? And I'm pushing a little bit, but that's what I want to do here. How do we do less of this and more of this? And of course, I'm an academic. I have a response now that I've set up the question. And my response is a set of guiding principles and a bunch of examples about what I mean by them. And they're things that are very socially oriented because these new settings of data use require that type of thinking, I argue. So I'm going to run through a little bit of context for each of these and then examples. Because again, I want to reset what normal looks like, right? Normal doesn't have to look like a bunch of animated scatter plots. Normal can look like the things I'm going to show you. So the first point, let's start with one. Keep track of my time here. First point, build a culture of impact. And in this way, I want to talk about how those existing new settings of data use can inspire us. Okay? So these pro-social institutions, the museums, the libraries, the newsrooms, the CSOs, the nonprofits, the community groups, they do these sorts of things. They help curate, they craft, they interpret. These are all mechanisms that we can learn from to activate latent creativity to help push outside that box of bar charts and related charts. Okay? So I want to give you one example. And this example comes from activists in Mexico. And they started, Marta Muñoz Arizabal is the main person I interviewed for this project. They were working with a group of mothers in El Fuerte? Yeah, in El Fuerte, okay? And these people, these mothers, built a collective to search for their missing husbands, sons, daughters, right? If you're familiar with Desaparecidos, it's a movement across different parts of Latin America. A bunch of people went missing, presumed dead. These mothers go out and try to recover the bodies and find the evidence and collect the memories together of the people that are missing. So Marta worked with them and with a WhatsApp group decided they wanted to activate this data, right? It's a data set of missing persons. So they activate it by collecting quotes and pictures. I've blurred some of them on the right there. It's a spreadsheet, right? A mixed media. It's a data set, right? They created a qualitative and quantitative data set of missing people. But they didn't publish a report. They turned it into an art piece. And then what the art piece is they created these circles, these spheres, that held a photo and a statement that they wish they would say, that they want to say to the person that's missing. And they created 50 of these. There were far more people in the spreadsheet, but they created 50 of them. And they put them in these spheres, in these bowls, with dirt from their homeland, right, from where they were from. And they presented it on Mother's Day across the city. This is in DF, in Mexico City. They presented it, and they marched with these bowls. So women carrying these big spheres, right, with dirt, and then the little sphere inside of it that's cast resin of the memory of the person. Right? It evokes an image of the womb. It speaks with a power that's just like every time I watch the videos, I start crying. This is activating a data set for impact. Right? It's not a report. It's about changing society in response to data that they are producing. And I think these are the inspirations we need for these new settings of data use. These particularly are inspirations about impact here. Okay. Second one. Building pathways to participation. Traditionally, the formats we have of data participation might look like answering a survey question, right? But very often, you're answering a survey question from some other that is then going to do the analysis. So how can we switch the script? How can we flip it? And we can flip it by acknowledging that very often we, as data scientists or people that work with data that looks like that. It looks like a spreadsheet, when in fact, we can have it look like something different, something more inviting, something that invites participation in a way that isn't filling out a survey or encoding a cell. And participation is a key goal that drives across so many points of working with data. And I want to use the example of data murals, which I've been working on for about 15 years with my wife, to talk about this. Now, painting data on walls is not a new idea. Around the same time we were starting to think about it, there was a bunch of other work about people trying to say, hey, how can we put data in place? Most of you probably know Jose Duarte's handmade visuals, which has continued to innovate since then. Those are some other examples. So data in space changes your relationship to it. And there's a long history of public murals changing conversation about public issues of relevance, right? We see it in political speech, we see it in the Mexican murals, we see it in the Southwest US. So there's a tradition of using murals to influence public conversation about something. So we said, my wife is an artist and a facilitator, we said, well, what if we make a data mural? Doesn't seem like anybody's tried to do that before. What would it look like? How could we use that as a tool to create new ways for participation in data presentation? So we did. We've done about 12 of these around the world, and we're excited that people have been doing these since then in other places. This was one of them that we created. It looks kind of like an infographic. This is painted at a community farm near my home in Boston. And this was a group of youth that were looking at data about their urban farm. So this is painted behind it on a big corrugated metal fence, maybe 50 meters long. And the youth looked at data about a couple different things, and I'll just narrate quickly what the story says here. It's talking about how on your left there, sugar and other issues and bad nutrition are causing a lot of health issues. And then we have one of the youth painting how they've recovered. There's a bunch of empty lots that the city owns that they've recovered and planted as raised beds. The vegetables in those beds are being sold at mobile markets that are being staffed and gardened by youth who say things like, before working here, I never knew that vegetables could taste good. You add to that children from the schools that are coming to work on those programs, and all of that together is a formula for better living together. We painted this mural in 2013, and that story was all the youth looking at the data, coming up with that narrative. We facilitated them designing the visual, painting it. The mayor came. We had a ribbon cutting ceremony. We were able, through that piece of artwork, to uplift the problem and their solution to it, using a data story. Right? It's clearly a data story. In this way, it uses the visual language of infographics. And since then, it's been talked about in the city as an example, both by politicians and community groups. So we're able to influence the type of narrative being told about food security in our community and what people are eating through the use of this visual form. Plus, it's fun. It's fun to get a bunch of people together to design something. And our facilitation usually looks like this. This was one we did at a school in Brazil, in Minas Gerais, where we lead them through a bunch of creative activities to find a story they want to tell based on the data, and then create a collaborative visual design, and then paint that as a community mural. So we're activating a long-standing participatory process, creating community murals, this time with data, to shift what participation means and what it can look like. And this, to me, is an example of trying to push back on that sort of bar chart. Like, let's blow up that toolbox, right, which might be constrained to just charts and graphs. Let's blow it up to find more effective and engaging settings, mechanisms to work in these new settings where data is being used, which I'm particularly focused on community-level settings. Right? Geographically co-located places where you can bring a bunch of people together around data to empower and connect them. So we've been excited because these data murals have taken off. They're being painted all over the world now, which is awesome, because it's a low-hanging fruit. Right? It's very easy access. So a third point, build mirrors, not windows. As I mentioned before, a lot of data projects are, if there's some community over there, we get the data, we pull it out through a window, we work with the data, and then maybe we show it back to them. But we're reserving some other. I think that's a very problematic dynamic, particularly around questions of power. And many of the responses we've had to that have been around building a form of data literacy. Right? How many of you participated in like a data literacy project or an exercise? So a couple of you, yeah, like a bunch of people in here. It's become a standard term, right? The idea that we need to increase data literacy. Usually it focuses on statistical capacity or computational capacity, right? Or science, sort of mathematic reasoning. That's usually what focuses on. I think that's a bit problematic because who does that really benefit? Who can access that? So I think data literacy is, well, I've done a bunch of data literacy programs. I think we need to, again, sort of push what that means and what it looks like. And in this case, I want to do it with a technique called data sculptures. And I want to give you a story of one of them that we created. This was in a lot of, around the pandemic, there were a ton of data sculptures being created. We wanted to do something around data, my wife and I again. We collaborate a lot. We were looking at SNAP applications. So SNAP, if you don't know, is the state level doling out of food assistance money. So you get, in Massachusetts, you get a debit card that you can use to help buy groceries that gets automatically filled up. Super helpful program. SNAP applications went through the roof when the pandemic set in. And then, they fell off as federal programs came in to assist, and they spiked again. This number, I don't know if this is a pointer. No, this number up here is crazy, that 20,000. So we realized that there was a story here. That was a comprehensible number, maybe. During the early months of the pandemic, an average of 1,659 new households were applying for SNAP benefits every day in Massachusetts. Right? Those were people asking, hey, I need help, which is a big number, but one that I think is almost comprehensible. I can think of 1,000 households. Maybe that's the size of my kid's high school. Right? But that chart doesn't really tell that story. It doesn't bring you in to do something about it. Right? So, how can we show a mirror back to the community? So we worked with people to create a data sculpture. This data sculpture is called 1659. It's made out of 1,659 pieces of cutlery welded together. My wife did all the welding because I'm really bad at welding. I did a couple on the bottom left, but they fell off the first time we picked it up and put it in our car and then pulled it out. So I left that to her. And we co-conceived of this, created it, and showed it for about 2 years around the Boston area. And the idea was, how could this work as a mirror to the community? Right? So people came up to this, they were like, oh, what's up with this table? What's the point here? We had this plaque next to it, which had a QR code, so you could go see the data report, watch vignettes like that video just played about stakeholders, key stakeholders that were involved in the systems. But it activates a different type of questioning. We had a time when someone helped us move it into a farmer's market, and they were like, oh, what is this? And we're like, well, here's what it is. It's this, you can apply for these benefits. And the guy said, oh, can I apply for that? And we said, yes, go right to that table over there where they can help you sign up, because it's actually quite hard to enroll in it, especially if English isn't your first language. These sculptures, they act as a different way to engage and get into a data story. And I think that matters because they work well as mirrors back to a community in a way that you can really understand and connect with. Now, in 2020, we saw a lot of these. The two examples on your right here are, if you remember Cuomo's COVID mountain that he used, which was this giant science fair project that he used to explain how New York City didn't want to climb the mountain again and needed more help. You may have seen these really poignant chair. All over the US, these popped up. I have a folder with 50 photos of cities around the US where they would just set up chairs for all the people that had passed away and have them in the town square. And it was just super poignant to see empty chairs. Very simple, very accessible. On the other side, you see an example that I think, Lauren, you're going to talk about later. Are you talking about the sculpture too, or just the visual? Yeah. So many of you know the super famous visual of the Brooks slave ship. It's often told as a story of this first civic data visualization. You will hear a wonderful retelling of that later from Lauren. But most people don't know that Wilberforce, who was one of the main abolitionist fighters at the time in the UK, fighting for the abolition of slavery, also created a sculpture. This data sculpture, which is in a museum that I would like to visit somewhere in the UK. It's a tiny little boat. It's a boat that was the same data of the visual, showing the amount of enslaved people that were put onto this boat. And you could take the layers apart and see it, hold it in your hand, carved out of wood, painted, right? So you could take it apart and see in your hand what it was like. And they made a bunch of these and distributed them. And I think that the idea that they accompanied this visual with this sculpture is really interesting to think about. That even back then, they were trying to use every tool they could to abolish this horrific history of slavery. I think that's a unique part of the story that often is overlooked. So data sculptures, an opportunity to show a mirror back to a community. Again, I'm just trying to reset what normal might be. You may not know, a couple hundred years ago, people were making data sculptures. And then there's older things like the Kipu that people point at. If you're curious about those, check out the amazing Data Physicalization Wiki. Has a wonderful history of that. Okay, so another point. I argue that in these settings, we have to create layers of reading. What do I mean by layers of reading? If you've been to a museum, or maybe a science museum, I do a lot of work on museum exhibit design, you'll know that you need to plan for a 5-second interaction with an exhibit, or 30 minutes. And everything in between. You have to plan for everything. And you do that by creating what I talk about as layers of reading, right? A simple way to understand something, and then more depth and more depth and more depth. But even if someone walks right away, they hopefully walk away with some nugget, okay? In museum settings, we talk about this like the all, some, few. Like everyone walks away with this, some people get this, a very small amount of people get this. So I think our toolbox for that is very limited. We see things like Bertin's visual variables and things like the animated scatter plots. I sometimes try to push on this by talking about it as the tyranny of the 2D. Right? Like we're stuck in this idea that we have to do visualizations. A wonderful counterpoint is this piece from the LAPD, the other LAPD, the Los Angeles Poverty Department. So, and they did a project in Skid Row, which has a huge unhoused population. And LAPD is that community organizing group for the unhoused population. They have a theatrical troupe of primarily unhoused people. And there was some new legislation coming out where they were trying to change the zoning. So they would basically kick out all the homeless people and build fancy housing, right? It happens every few years in Skid Row. So as part of their protests, they created this amazing playable mini golf course inspired by the data, which I could talk for an hour about just that. But they also, in that playable mini golf course, they created a theatrical production where they talked about they created a theater piece that was half improvised, half devised, where people joined. This is people watching the performance there. And on the actual mini golf course, they played out the wheelings and dealings of corrupt officials that led to this zoning being proposed. Right? And it was, 2 years later, half of those politicians that were mocked in their play were in prison. So it's demonstrably illegal. And they did it on the golf course, right? We all have this symbol of golf as a place where the backroom deals are made. But this whole golf course was designed around data. Right? Each hole was designed around data, which I think is delightful because I love mini golf, and it's a super fun way to create a public spectacle to bring people in. Right? And they used theater as a way to show that. And they had them act it out as a way to bring people into the issue. And then they combined it with teaching, like sit-ins where they learned stuff and things like that. But they used the power of theater as a way to communicate topics. That builds on a long history particularly in Brazil with Augusto Barral's work on theater of the oppressed, if you know that. And then there's a couple other examples you might know. 100% City is a long-standing piece where people use embodiment, right? This uses the idea of data embodiment. So it's physical like a data sculpture, but using your body, we're starting to see with some research that we're doing that this changes how you connect to something. It changes how you understand data. And then some of you might know Spirit of Joy at MoMA. It's a famous piece about gender representation in the MoMA collection. So hopefully I have some more coming soon about that. I'm working with a wonderful group of people at Northeastern. We're calling ourselves the Data Theater Collaborative now. Sorry, I cut off Angelique's last name. Anyway, we hope to have some more examples soon. We're hoping some funding lands to explore the idea of civic data theater. Instead of having an evening civic meeting with a PowerPoint like this, where people come if they can and ask questions, which happens across the US, we devise with a community group a short theatrical piece, 30 minutes, in our case about green space and gentrification, perform it, and then have a 30-minute facilitated dialogue afterwards to talk about the issue in a very different way than the sort of presentational civic meeting, but a more participatory artistic way. And that whole thing, we have a process for doing that driven around data. On the right here, you see some students experimenting with that. We've written a couple papers about this, and we're hoping to do a bigger experiment soon. So keep your fingers crossed. Hopefully we'll have more there. The last one I want to do is talking about building more doorways to engaging with data by using all of our senses. And I mean all of them. We live in a multisensory world, but like the word in the title of this thing is visualization, right? We're confining ourselves to one of our 5 senses in a way that's very, I think, troublesome for me and causes a lot of problems and limits our creative potential. We've talked about physicalization a little bit. I tend to talk about data sculptures because I find physicalization very hard to say, the word itself. But what about the other things? What about smellification, edibilization, sonification? We have all these other range of things we can use to engage people. So I argue that we need to do more of it and hold up the examples that are doing that. Why? Because there's power in these other senses. There's power of like triggering memories, connecting to culture, evoking experiences, getting you into a reflective state and inviting curiosity. These senses work better for those than just looking at something. And I mean better for different people, right? Somebody might love looking at a visualization, pulling it apart. Someone else, it might not click at all. You might need to do something where you can get into something by tasting it. We need a broader set of doorways to invite people into things. Now, people have been doing this work. You have a smell map of Milan from a couple years ago. Many of you might know the data cuisine projects from Stefaner and Jaško. You might know Two-Tone, which I think is you start each episode of your podcast with Two-Tone, which is software for doing sonification. So we're seeing some experiments here. Sonification, I think, is the most teased out. For decades, we've had sonification society in meetings, particularly in astronomy, does a lot of it. I'll give you another coming soon. I'm working on a sonification to be performed because I think we're not doing enough with live performance. There's a couple of examples, but I play Brazilian percussion, so I'm working with, again, they cut it off, Marcus Santos and Lily Garaby to create a to-be-named data sonification about climate change data that we're hoping to have ready to perform live with a big troupe of like 25 Brazilian drummers at maybe around Earth Day in the spring to try to, again, open a new door to understand and get engaged with an issue that otherwise can be really hard to get into. So I'm trying to create more examples to, again, normalize, hey, you can do all these things. And particularly, in this case, we have museums do a lot of smellification. They give ambient scents to pull you into something. Museums do a lot of touch. I'm trying to do this with a newspaper that's reporting about climate change data, because these are community groups that can activate a group of people in a way that you can't otherwise. So I'm trying to leverage that power in data settings. So I'm going to wrap up here. I call this practice popular data, inspired by Freire's way of thinking about popular education in Brazil, if you know it. But the idea that we need to build a bigger toolbox to meet people where they are, because this one isn't working. Right? It's not right for lots of sets of people. So I think we need to reset that and just fight back against that default of making that bar chart that is the button that's so easy. So I am excited to announce that exposition and those examples are coming out as a book later this month. And as you can tell, I like playing with things a little bit and having fun with it. So I decided to do a book launch video that I'm going to show you all. And in this case, I decided to have extra fun with it because, like, my brother writes a lot of books and he has book launch parties all the time, and usually has like fancy drinks and stuff, and he has a speaker or two, and then there's like a book deal. But I was like, well, you're doing a book launch, bro. I think you can be more creative. And I'll give a shout out to my daughter, who actually came up with the idea of doing this kind of book launch. Oh, can I get volume? Or do I need to change the output to Creston to get the volume? Oh, okay. Oh, man. All right, I'm going to do this because I think it's worth it, because I have some narration. While I do this, so I'll switch up. So I'm going to do that in a second. Your assignment was to find one example that spoke to you, okay? So the next thing I want you to do is you're going to stand up again, talk to that person you did earlier, and tell them the one example from all those I threw out that spoke to you, okay? You're going to give you 3 minutes, and while you do that, I'm going to set up the audio. Go for it. Okay, thanks. Okay, all right. Thank you. Hopefully there was something that clicked for you that you felt like was a rich example that might connect with your work. We have an audio hack, so I'm going to play my book launch video just to give you a sense, because I'm excited about this book coming out, and there's a discount code, but I also like doing silly things. Hi everyone, I'm so excited to share that my book Community Data is coming out this November. So I decided, why do a boring book launch party or an unboxing video when I can combine a book with a rocket and do an actual book launch? I connected with the amazing CMAS Model Rocketry Group, and with my family's help tried out various rocket designs to build something that we hoped would work.
And one going up in 5, 4, 3, 1, lift
Yeah. Thanks. I had a lot of fun with that. And thank you very much. The book's coming out at the end of the month. I appreciate it. Thanks for the time. Hopefully that it catches some inspiration for you.
Thank you so much, Rahul. That was fantastic. I read that book. You should read it. It's great. The book is not out yet, obviously, as Rahul was saying, but if you are interested in it, outside there is a table with tons of books. Rahul's book is not in there, but there's a QR code where you can get more information about the book. I strongly recommend it. It's absolutely fantastic. And even wrote about it for my newsletter a while ago. Anyway, so we have time for perhaps 1 or 2 questions. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. What I take from all of your project is that you use art to express the data inside. And then those two are very different skill sets. One is analytical, one is like creative. As for me, as a student in data science, someone could argue that we focus a lot on the analytical side, but lack of the creativity side. So 2 questions. One, when you create such a project, do you have a group of people to leverage skill sets on both sides? Or if not, then how can we improve on the creativity side of skills? Thank you.
That's a great question. So the question is about like creativity and analytics and how we pull those 2 things together. I have 2 main responses. The first is part of my goal is to give you permission to play. All right. So like if you get back into that playful mindset, I think most of us in the room have that creative potential to do it if you're given permission to and a structure to engage it. The second answer is, even if you don't feel comfortable, in your community there is, right? So if you want to do a data mural, anywhere you live, there's going to be an art teacher that is amazing at this. There's going to be a group of youth that want to come out and do this. You just got to go find them. And just like in the room, like connecting with people is one of the ways to make that happen. And just like I asked you to stand up and talk to each other, a lot of this work is built on that, on forcing yourself to get out in a community and connect with people around data. Data is a great way to bring people together. If you sort of hold an event and use some of these arts-based invitations around data, people love showing up, especially if you have food, but they love showing up, So I think this idea of data as a convener is a really powerful way to do that, because the latent creative potential of your community is massive. It's massive. You just need to tap into it.
Another question? Yes.
Thank you very much. I have a question regarding data colonialism, a term coined by Nick Couldry in UK. So what do you think of data extraction? Is data colonialism like when you extract data, like all these developed countries and also from these developing countries, and this ethical use of data and privacy? Like you used all this sensation and all these other emotions also, but when you use all these data collection things, like you should also think about ethical and moral side of privacy, private information, and how to extract this data with people's consent and how to use it and not to give it to big marketing companies.
Yeah, thank you for using that language. That's a big driver of my work. I learn a lot not only from indigenous data governance, but also sort of examples from around the world. When I'm in a more like academic writing space, I tend to use the framework of epistemological resistance, which is borrowed from anti-colonial studies. So as a set of work that I try to embody goals of epistemological resistance, I'm arguing that the ways of thinking about data are rooted in colonial historical contexts. And these responses are my attempt to argue, here are ways to do it in another way. Here are ways to fight against the way of thinking that is about extractive data production, assessment, and then decision-making for some other. So I'm so glad that you caught on to that, and I appreciate you naming it. I never know in quite which rooms to use those words, but in those settings, like the main helpful guidance for me is epistemological resistance.
Thank you so much again, Rahul. Thank you so much.
Thanks.